Welcome to History with Herodotus, where we delve into the depths of human experience, unearthing the stories that have shaped our world. Today, we embark on a journey through one of the most tumultuous periods in modern Chinese history, the Great Chinese Famine, a catastrophic event that ravaged the nation from 1959 to 1961. This tragic episode, born from a complex interplay of politics, economics, and environmental factors, would ultimately claim millions of lives, leaving an indelible mark on the psyche of a nation. To understand the genesis of this calamity, we must first traverse the landscape of China in the early 20th century, a land in turmoil. The Chinese Civil War, which pitted the Communist Party of China, CPC, against the Nationalist Party, KMT, had finally subsided with the CPC's victory in 1949. Mao Zedong, the charismatic leader of the Communists, stood at the helm of a newly formed People's Republic of China, envisioning a radical transformation of the country into a socialist state. Mao's ambition was not merely to govern, but to reshape China's very fabric. He initiated a series of sweeping reforms and campaigns aimed at rapidly industrializing and collectivizing the nation. Among these, the first five-year plan, 1953 to 1957, was particularly notable for its emphasis on heavy industry development, mirroring the Soviet model. This period saw significant advancements in infrastructure and industrial production, but also laid the groundwork for future imbalances, as the focus on heavy industry came at the expense of agricultural development. As Mao's vision for China evolved, so did his methods. The 100 Flowers campaign of 1956 to 1957, intended to foster intellectual freedom and criticism, was abruptly succeeded by the anti-rightist movement, which brutally suppressed dissenting voices. This marked a turning point in Mao's rule, as he increasingly relied on mass mobilization campaigns to achieve his goals, often disregarding the advice of more cautious comrades. One such campaign would prove particularly disastrous: the Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958 with the aim of transforming China into a socialist society through rapid agricultural and industrial growth. The plan was characterized by ambitious targets for grain production and the establishment of people's communes, where peasants would live and work together, sharing resources and labor. Mao envisioned these communes as the building blocks of a new, communist society, but in reality, they would become instruments of control and tools for extracting surplus labor from an already strained agricultural sector. The summer of 1958 saw the fervent implementation of the Great Leap Forward, with peasants being organized into large communes and pushed to meet unrealistic production targets. The emphasis was on quantity over quality, with Mao and other leaders boasting of imminent agricultural abundance and the advent of a communist utopia. However, the seeds of disaster were sown in these early days, as local cadres, under pressure to report successes, began to exaggerate production figures, creating a false narrative of prosperity that would have devastating consequences. As 1958 drew to a close, signs of trouble began to emerge. Grain production, while increased in some areas, was not meeting the fantastical targets set by Mao and his followers. The backyard steel furnaces, another hallmark of the Great Leap Forward, were producing useless, low-quality steel at great environmental cost. Meanwhile, the communal dining halls, meant to symbolize the equality and shared prosperity of communist life, often served as centers for food waste and inefficiency. As the winter of 1958 to 1959 set in, the full extent of the Great Leap Forward's failures began to manifest. The grain harvest, which had been touted as a record-breaking success, was in reality meager, and the lack of incentives for peasants to work efficiently in the communal system led to widespread apathy and neglect of agricultural duties. By January 1959, reports of food shortages began to surface from various provinces, with peasants struggling to access even the most basic staples. The situation deteriorated further as the spring of 1959 arrived, bringing with it a devastating combination of natural disasters and human error. Severe weather conditions, including floods in the south and droughts in the north, ravaged already fragile crops, while the misguided agricultural practices promoted by the Great Leap Forward, such as close planting and deep plowing, led to soil erosion and decreased fertility. In Anhui Province, for example, the once thriving fields lay barren and still, a testament to the folly of Mao's grandiose plans. By the summer of 1959, famine had begun to grip large swaths of rural China, with peasants facing unimaginable hardships as they struggled to find enough food to sustain themselves. In some areas, people resorted to eating wild plants, bark, and even clay in a desperate bid to fill their empty bellies. The normally resilient Chinese countryside was descending into chaos as families were forced to abandon their homes in search of sustenance, leaving behind the frail, the elderly, and the very young. In August 1959, a meeting of the Communist Party's Central Committee was convened at Lushan, where Mao faced mounting criticism from his comrades for the catastrophic consequences of the Great Leap Forward. Peng Dehuai, the defense minister, dared to speak out against Mao's policies, warning of the dangers of continued famine and social unrest. However, Mao would not be swayed and instead launched a vicious attack on Peng and other critics, labeling them rightists and counter-revolutionaries. As the autumn of 1959 wore on, the situation continued to deteriorate, with reports of cannibalism, infanticide, and other horrific acts of desperation emerging from the most affected areas. In the province of Henan, for instance, a group of starving peasants was said to have eaten the flesh of a recently deceased neighbor, an act that would haunt their consciences for years to come. The famine had become a humanitarian crisis of unimaginable proportions, with millions of people facing starvation, disease, and death. By the winter of 1959 to 1960, the Chinese government was forced to confront the reality of its own failures as foreign journalists and diplomats began to report on the scale of the disaster. Mao, still unwilling to admit defeat, continued to insist that the Great Leap Forward was a success and that the famine was merely a temporary setback caused by external factors such as weather and sabotage. However, as the death toll mounted, it became increasingly clear that the true culprit was not nature or foreign enemies, but the misguided policies of the Communist Party itself. In January 1960, a secret report compiled by the party's investigation team revealed a shocking truth. Over 25 million people had already perished in the famine, with many more likely to follow. The report, which would remain classified for decades, painted a grim picture of a countryside in ruins, where entire villages had been wiped out, and survivors were forced to live like animals, scavenging for scraps in a desolate landscape. As the news spread, even the most loyal party cadres began to question Mao's leadership, and the very foundations of the communist regime started to tremble. As the secret report's findings spread, the Communist Party was forced to take action, and in 1960, a series of emergency measures were implemented to alleviate the suffering of the population. Grain imports were increased, and a more realistic approach to agriculture was adopted, allowing farmers to return to traditional methods and abandoning the disastrous policies of the Great Leap Forward. The government also began to provide limited relief to the most affected areas, including food aid and medical supplies. However, for many, it was too little, too late. The famine had already exacted a devastating toll, with estimates suggesting that between 20 and 45 million people lost their lives during this period. As news of the disaster slowly trickled out to the wider world, international condemnation began to mount, and China's reputation as a responsible member of the global community was severely tarnished. In the aftermath of the famine, Mao's leadership was severely weakened, and he was eventually forced to relinquish some of his powers to more pragmatic leaders such as Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. These leaders implemented a series of economic reforms which began to repair the damage caused by the Great Leap Forward and laid the foundations for China's eventual emergence as an economic superpower. The legacy of the Great Chinese Famine continues to be felt today, with many regarding it as one of the darkest periods in modern Chinese history. As the Chinese economist and food security expert Sheng Yinfan has noted, the Great Leap Forward famine was a man-made disaster that resulted from a combination of radical policies, poor governance, and lack of transparency. This tragic event serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of authoritarianism, ideology-driven policymaking, and the importance of protecting human rights and individual freedoms. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition of the famine's significance both within China and internationally. In 2013, the Chinese government officially acknowledged the famine for the first time, and while it did not provide a full accounting of the disaster, it marked an important step towards coming to terms with this painful period in the country's history. As the historian and sinologist Jonathan Spence has observed, the Great Leap Forward was a colossal failure of imagination, a failure to think about the consequences of actions on a gigantic scale. The famine's impact extends far beyond China's borders, serving as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of accountability, and the need for transparency in governance. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.